Care to move that the House take note of miscellaneous business.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Dr. Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, there could not be a greater contrast in these very difficult times between the positive and strong leadership from John Key and the desperate, the divided and the dysfunctional Labour Party opposite. You see, members opposite just don't seem to get it that here we are facing the worst global downturn since the Great Depression, the biggest natural disaster this country has faced in half a century, as well as the awful mining tragedy at Pike. Now more than at any time, we need strong, disciplined and focused leadership. And what the Labour Party has proved in the last fortnight is they cannot manage themselves, let alone govern this country. Let's look at the contrast. Over the recess period, we had the Prime Minister announcing the business and employment assistance for Christchurch. We've had the Minister of Finance, Bill English, announcing the delivery of more efficient and better public services. You've had Jerry Brownlee announcing the decisions about Christchurch and the government's recovery plans for that city. In just 6 weeks exactly today, since that massive quake struck Christchurch, this government's been focused on what matters. Getting people's water back on, now 100%. Getting people's housing connected back on the electricity, now up to 99%. Getting thousands of new heating systems so that people will be warm for winter. And Tolly, working on getting our schools up and running and children back to school. Getting the sewage fixed back up now to 94%. It's been a sterling effort, and Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of this government and I'm proud of those people doing the hard yards in Christchurch, getting that city rebuilt. I compare the progress with cities like Kobe, like San Francisco, and I say that we compare very well in the progress that we've made in just 6 weeks. And I note that there's been a new word, Mr. Speaker, added to New Zealand's vocabulary, munted. And I think it's because the people of Christchurch are too polite to use the F word when in respect of buildings they've been wrecked. Well, Mr. Speaker, munted is the perfect word to describe the Labour Party. Over recess, Labour's been dysfunctional, they've been divided, they've been distracted. You've had the Labour Party president attacking the leader. You've had MPs and candidates saying that Gough just doesn't cut the mustard and hasn't been managing things properly. You've had torchbearers for the left describing the leader of the opposition as the walking wounded and a Clayton's leader. It's got worse this week with Labour manipulating their party list. What does it say about the standard of the list that they actually don't want the next 5 people on the list back? Or, Mr. Speaker, is it actually things so bad that actually those Labour Party ex-members don't want to be associated with the Labour caucus opposite? Mr. Speaker, what's going on in respect of MMP is underhand, it's a rort, it makes a farce of MMP. If Labour's got so little confidence in its list, perhaps it should let those slots go to parties in this parliament that have competent, fresh and talented people that want to make a contribution to this party. I know on the national list we've got at least a dozen there that would be up to the task of making a contribution. And then, Mr. Speaker, we have the ridiculous spectacle of David Cunliffe demanding the resignation of the Minister of Finance over finance company collapses and the cost of the Crown guarantee. Mr. Speaker, you would think these problems were of Mr. English making. I'd remind them 36 finance companies had gone to the wall even before we'd been on government, and I want to commend the work of Bill English and Simon Power for doing the hard yards without focusing on blaming the opposition, of fixing up the finance mess that was left by members like David Cunliffe.
Mr. Speaker, how fascinating.
Members will cease speaking when the bell goes. The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr. Speaker, how fascinating that the member that's just resumed his seat spent his whole time talking about the Labor Party, never once defending the government's record on the economy, when we got 180,000 people unemployed. Mr. Speaker, National's mishandling of the South Canterbury finance collapse is a disaster of epic proportions, and New Zealand community assets are going to be flogged off to pay for it. Mr. Speaker, Bill English and his mates turned down recapitalisation offers which on Treasury's own documents would have limited liability to around $500 million. The tab is $1.2 billion and rising. What company CFO would have made a $700 million cock-up and kept his job? He's bet the company, he's beggared a whole year's budget round, and he's still sitting there and blaming the Labor Party. Blaming the Labor Party when he signed the thing in, when he extended it in the guarantee, even though John Key says he had Treasury in his office week after week, months after month, since the day he was elected, telling him South Canterbury Finance was a dog, but he rolled it over again in the guarantee scheme. You know, Fran O'Sullivan is no apologist for the Labor Party, but she says it is risible that the government did not simply pull the plug when the finance company's auditor Ernst & Young ran the ruler over it. She said instead it became the beneficiary of an extended government guarantee scheme, extraordinary given that Kortementha had been advising the government since mid-2009. She says the government could have mitigated the Crown's overall exposure by putting it into statutory management months ago. And we would add, sir, they could have limited it later if they had accepted one of a number of bids for recapitalisation. Now, they may have been worried about an Australian merchant bank owning part of it. Why, I don't know. They're supposed to be trans-Tasman friendly. But they can't possibly object to the New Zealand Superannuation Fund or Naitahu buying a slice, because they're not going anywhere. They're not going anywhere. They were prepared to share the risk. But Bill English wanted all the risk for the taxpayer. And now they are sucking on a $1.2 billion kumra because they had the pride and the misjudgment, and it came before a big, big fall. And what I want to know, Mr. Speaker, is not just how bad their mathematics is and why, but I want to know what pressures were brought to bear on the government for that colossal cock-up, because I suspect that there were various constituencies in their ear saying, what about our debt? What about our debt? And why was it that when the recap discussions were on in August 31st, the government insisted the company be thrown into receivership to wipe out all the equity holders, but they were happy to extend the debt guarantee so that every deposit holder did very well, and some did extremely well, especially some of the institutional senior debt holders who made a killing at the taxpayers' expense, while mum and dad Kiwi are picking up the tab and now are faced with the prospect of privatisation to fill in the hole. Now, people out there might ask, is this a big problem really? How big is this? Well, the difference between what the government thought it was going to pay and what it's ended up paying is, wait for it, a whole year's budget round of new money. $700 million is the amount that John Key just announced he was cutting out of the budget to make the blackest zero budget in decades. $700 million, ironically, is the amount that they've lost so far over and above the Treasury's own estimates of their liability. It's a $700 million mistake. Who else survives a $700 million mistake in the real world? People get sacked for less than that. Why is Bill English still sitting there? People get sacked for much less than that. Jamie Lee Ross would have been sacked from the council if he had made a they wouldn't have let him near a $700 million cheque. Would they, just as well? Can you imagine Mr Quinn making a $700 million... Well, I can, but I can't imagine him having the chequebook. Bill English has made a $700 million mistake. Has John Key defended him? Here's John Key. Oh, our mess. Who signed it in? Who signed it in? There was bipartisan agreement on the deposit scheme. National signed it in.
Order. The Honourable Tony Ryle.
Okay.